Shermin, thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited to hear your story. You've written a book, and it's an interesting topic. It's about stoicism, and I think or Stoic empathy, should I say. I think that's so important. And like I said earlier, it's not many women that speak about it. So I'm really excited to hear about what your take is on that. But before we go there, if you could just
Hmm.
give us a bit of background about what led you to this point, what happened in your life that led you to making a book about stoicism.
Of course, I'd be happy to. So with Stoicism, what led me to it? Wow. Okay. I was born in Iran and I was there until the age of 11. I left in 88. So the Islamic Revolution happened in 79. And then the Iran-Iraq War took place starting in 1980, and about a million people died during that war. At the time in Iran, there was about 40 million people, so that's about 1 out of 40 people. So my childhood was essentially spent in the immediate aftermath of the revolution in Iran, as well as throughout the war and throughout the height of the war as well, at which time there were up to 6 missile attacks a day into civilian areas, into the city where I lived, which was Tehran, the capital. During that time, Natasha, I learned a very interesting thing that I certainly haven't taught my kids, and that I hope most kids don't have to learn. I essentially learned to lead a double life. I learned how to very, very carefully control the facade of what I presented to the outside world in order to remain safe, while having as much internal freedom within our home as I could, right? And that was what my parents encouraged. And, and it's things like as simple as you pretend you don't drink alcohol, even though your parents have alcohol, or you pretend you don't listen to Western music, even though you have dance parties in your house, whatever the case might be. Very small matters, certainly nothing dangerous, but they were considered criminal by the regime. That internal external dichotomy became for me something that I became very adept at, but also something that I became very traumatized by. I grew up becoming very, very particular about authenticity and ensuring that the person who I represent to be, since I have immigrated to a democratic country and am much more able to express those freedoms, that the person who I express myself to be is very, very closely, I mean, it can never be exactly who you are. There's deep philosophical issues there, but it's very, very closely aligned with who I am and what I think of myself. However, I also learned about the power of that balance. And what I learned is that if I move that balance inward, which is feel what I want to feel, think what I want to think at a time that is appropriate without making it into something that violates the truth of the feeling itself, right? Without something that violates the truth of the moment or the truth of the way I rationalize or cognitively think about things. And I learned to hold those two things together. And I started to study philosophy and neuropsychology. And then I went to law school and became an expert in advocacy. And I essentially became an advocate, where you do a lot of this work, actually, and did this for about 20 years and then started to teach and to write. Throughout that time, I had kids. And really, the moment where it hit home for me was about 10 years ago, when I was on the phone while mothering my children. They're a little bit older now. They were very young at the time. I had two 3-year-olds and a newborn. And I received some really traumatic news, some really terrible traumatic news relating to a family member. At that moment, I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. Both of those things would have been authentic to who I am. Heck, punching a wall would have been authentic. But I was with my children, with my very, very young children. And I knew that if I behaved in that way, that I would further traumatize my children. And so what I did was I enabled my empathic understanding of the needs of my children who are more vulnerable than I am and for whom I am responsible to allow me to further control my emotional state for their protection. And that's when I realized, oh my gosh, I can be really stoic around my kids because of how much empathy I have for them. And that was when I thought these two concepts are inexplicably intertwined. Empathy and stoicism, that is care for and connection with others, as well as contain and control over our own emotions and thoughts. And that's what I've written, Stoic Empathy. And it isn't masculine nor is it feminine, I would say. I agree with you that in the field of Stoicism, as its modern presentation, that it tends to be dominated by men. However, I think with this shift of thinking about it in this manner, of how it could actually be something we do as leaders, as parents, as members of a community to take care of each other, right? And how sometimes it's appropriate and sometimes there's a certain level of emotional engagement that's appropriate. And then understanding that balance and that relationship. And so then I poured my heart and soul into the research and the dialogue and signed the book deal 3 years ago and then did 3 more years of research. And the book is coming out April 8th, Stoic Empathy. And I couldn't be more thrilled. It's essentially the culmination of my internal state for the last 47 years of my life. So I'm very excited for it to be out there.
Wow, that's amazing. It makes so much sense how you put the two together. And I think the world needs it because, they're talking about a lot of men getting in touch with their female side, their feminine side. But what about women getting in touch with their masculine side? So that we can be whole without trying to find somebody else that is supposedly going to make us whole.
Yes, I love that. Taking control at a minimum of your own thoughts, your own judgments, your own emotions, but also allowing that, as well as your empathic understanding of the room, to help you create influence and power and control in a manner that helps you preserve your integrity and stay true to your values. When I became a lawyer, I entered this world of corporate law and corporate power, and I was a young, female minority, often the youngest in the room, often the only woman in the room. And my method of gaining influence and control was just never going to be slam my fist on the table and raise my voice at everyone. It wouldn't have been authentic to me, but honestly, Natasha, I don't even think I could have pulled it off, And so my method of influence and control had to be something else. And as I started examining it and as I started experimenting with it, I realized that I also have to be who I am. And so I try very hard not to moralize. I try very hard not to tell people what their ethics should be. Rather, I help them be consistent with their own ethic while gaining control in their own lives, right? That way, whatever it is that your moral code is, but there is a lot of discussion about just general human rights and ethics in the book, but that's on a very, very big level. On a small level, it's not up to me to tell you what's right to do in a particular circumstance. I'm not there. I'm not your therapist. I'm not your life coach. I'm not your best friend. I'm not your partner, etc. But what I can do is I can help you be true to who you are and do it while gaining influence and control. And really, and this part is so key, and this is where the empathy comes in too, maintaining positive long-term relationships, which not me, but every psychologist, every philosopher, every theological leader has said since the beginning of time is essential to human development, happiness, and fulfillment.
Yeah. So what does Stoic empathy actually look like?
So Stoic empathy is, as I've described it, it is this understanding of the others in the room initially, and then a recognition and a strategic decision as to how much to emotionally connect to the others in the room. So for example, what I mean by this is if you're a trauma surgeon and a patient gets rolled into the room, or if you are a counselor in a refugee camp and you're dealing with your third mass rape victim today, there is a certain amount and level of emotional disengagement that is necessary for you to be able to help that person. And I'm not in a moral position to judge that disengagement. If, on the other hand, it's your spouse, it's your child, it's your parent, it's your best friend, people with whom you want to have ongoing relationships, I would venture to say it would be significantly more important to have an emotional connection there. So the initial step would be sort of being strategic and thoughtful and intentional about how much of yourself you want to put into that empathy. Either way, you are experiencing empathy. Either way, you are aware of the needs of the other person and concerned for the other person, right? However, you're modulating your own emotional involvement and engagement depending on what you think is right, not just what your anger dictated, and this is where the Stoicism comes in, or what your sadness dictated, or what your impulses dictated, right? But precisely because you have gained Stoic control, or at least furthered your Stoic control of yourself, you can make these intentional decisions from situation to situation to situation. So then the Stoicism aspect of it, the control aspect of it, is really in modern day what we would call emotional regulation. It really is no different. Ancient Stoicism is modern day emotional regulation. It is, how do I monitor and understand my own feelings so that I can modulate and evaluate them and even manipulate them? How can I turn anxiety into excitement? How can I, you know what I mean? So how can I take these feelings and keep them, recognize them, but make sure they serve me? And if they're not serving me, find another way of experiencing, exploring, and letting go so that I can serve myself and, of course, others.
Yeah, I love the way you've explained that. Because as you're talking, I'm thinking of all the ways that it helps people to become consciously aware that just expressing their emotions because they're allowed to, because they're feeling it, doesn't always equate to making other people feel safe.
Yes, that is exactly true. What's interesting, and I write about this in the empathy section of the book. By the way, the book starts out with an empathy section and then goes into a stoicism section. What I start out talking about in the empathy section of the book is the brain science behind that expression of emotion, not just of yourself, but as you said, Natasha, that doesn't always make other people feel better, but of the other. If you can actually try to stop and understand, oh, this person seems angry, and then articulate, you seem angry, it's a diffuser, right? I mean, it literally on a neuroscience level, I cite a number of fMRI studies that, by the way, everything I cite in the book is peer reviewed and published in a scientific journal. I tried, not because they're the only valid studies, but just because I wanted the book to have very, very solid, hard medical foundations. I tried to stick to neuroscience and avoid just pure psychology. I myself am a big fan of psychology, not putting it down at all. I'm just saying for purposes of this book. So one of the things that does, that labeling of the emotion, is it diffuses the emotion by literally reducing the amount of activity in the amygdala of the other individual. So by understanding them, by verbalizing their feelings, you have actually helped to create control in the situation. And if you are able to do that in a manner that is non-judgmental, which is where your own stoic control comes in, right? In a manner that is non-judgmental, that is open to being wrong, right? And is genuinely interested in understanding and not proving a point, right? Because I feel like I did this all the time when I was starting out as a lawyer. I would summarize what the other person said, but in a way that suited my best interests and the counter argument, right?
Yeah.
And that's not the goal here. And that does not diffuse their anger. Be absolutely clear about that. So yeah, so it is like this incredible thing that you can do when you start combining these two things together on a day-to-day basis. And then of course, the more you practice it, the better you become at it in all sorts of contexts.
Yeah, that would have been my next question, is obviously the more you're working, the more you're bringing it out of survival mode, out of fight or flight response, the more you're consciously moderating your emotions. But also, as you're studying this stuff, you probably have become a lot more emotionally intelligent, should we say? Like your EQ would have just gone up because you realize on how many levels emotions actually operate, because there's always trauma under trauma under trauma.
What's fascinating, Natasha, is I'm on a press tour right now, so I'm talking to a lot of people. You're only the second person who has said that to me. And the first one was my sister. And I find it to be an incredibly insightful remark because it really is something that happens. Think about any passion that you have. So my passion is Stoic Empathy. Your passion might be painting or poetry. The more you study it, right, even more passionate do you become about it. And the more you learn about the details of it, the more fascinating and interesting it becomes to you. And so, yes, for the last 3 years, I've been fully immersed in this material. And I've been reading everything from neuroscience journals to attending Buddhism retreats, right? A lot of this stuff, by the way, is very similar to the Buddhist principles of acceptance. And evaluating the differences between those and then engaging in the practices to see how well they work and how do they work for me and what are the easy ones and what are the difficult ones and et cetera, et cetera. And so I've literally been living it for 3 years and it has had a substantial impact. Most would say I was already a reasonably controlled person to begin with as I've been steadily gaining in this in my life. But that is an example of how anybody can improve their ability to regulate their own emotions and their ability to influence the room by further studying the material.
Yeah, so but you've worked in high stake environments, so corporate law and all in international businesses. How do you apply it there? Because that's different. I mean, you don't want to have empathy for your opposition, or do you?
Why don't you? I mean, one of the things I talk about a lot at mergers and acquisitions conferences is, listen, it depends on the nature of the merger. If it's a hostile takeover of your company, the board is trying to kick you out of the company you founded that sells only one product, which is the thing you invented, and you want to get rid of them, then you're going to want less of an emotional engagement. But if it's a merger between you and another company, and together you're going to go take the world by storm, and post-merger integration is a very significant aspect of the functioning and the success of the newly merged entity, why don't you want to understand the other, right? Even if they're your enemy. So one of the things I talk about in both my TEDx talks actually is how I watched my mother handle this with the morality police on the streets of Iran. She certainly didn't feel bad for the morality police, but she understood them. And that understanding and ability to relate enabled her to get out of more situations than I could count. I've literally, 2 of my TED Talks have been about it. And she's really kind of remarkable. Of course, she wasn't trying to employ concepts of empathy or stoicism. She just knew how to get out of that bad situation. And it was a situation in which she had no power, no control, no long-term relationship, and no part of her wanted a long-term relationship, but she needed to control it. And so understanding her counterpart was actually a top priority. So that's what I mean when I say you kind of have to decide how much emotional engagement do I want, whether you're in a corporate setting, hostile takeover, or friendly M&A, or whether you are my mother negotiating your way through the streets of Iran, or a mom, right? Trying to figure out tech time with your kids, or a partner, right? I want to stay married. I like my husband, but I tend to be right a lot, and he tends to be wrong a lot. How do we solve this, right? How do we solve this? So yeah, how do I go about having that empathic understanding, even if we're in an argument, even if he is on the other side of the table about something I feel very strongly about? So yeah, and then you modulate your emotional connection to that person when you're
So
experiencing the empathy.
I would say that you would just basically, in the heat of the moment, take a step back and say, how do I want to handle this best? And it's just that pause where the truth would come through. The the higher version of what you could be doing instead of just reacting from your baseline.
I love that. It's absolutely remarkable what you said. Spot on accurate. And what's more is your baseline begins to shift. such that your baseline becomes fast evaluation. You barely need that split second before determining what to do next. And your habit becomes one of control and caution at the same time as compassion and care. And so you literally, I mean, the same way you might quit smoking, right? I mean, you literally no longer need to draw the cigarette to your mouth, right? And so it's the same thing. These instincts, these habits, these deep desires, these impulses that we have over the long term are subject to change. Obviously, over the short term, that's not going to be the case. Your impulse is still going to be your impulse. And the Greeks actually talk about this. They call them primary emotions, which they say are not in our control. And just sort of, when the doctor hits your knee, your leg pops up, right? It's literally a reflexive action. But again, what's really remarkable is with time, even those can be controlled. But from a starting point, you're absolutely right. You just take a breath, you engage in the analysis, you better understand what it is that you want to do. And then over time, you become better at it. I always sort of, and faster at it. I always sort of think of it as one of my favorite movies is The Matrix. And I think of the scene with Neo at the end. I don't know how much of your audience has seen The Matrix. It's, I don't know, probably a million years old now. I watched it when dinosaurs roamed the earth. I'm an old person. I don't know what to tell you. And there's this scene toward the end where the bullets are coming toward Neo, but it's almost as if it's in slow motion because the bullets slow down for him and he can even stop and touch the bullet as they're still going in real time. It is this kind of incredible power as your ability to cognitively process this type of information advances to slow down time. And it is, and we know this, we know that time is relative. We know that the way we experience it is relative to the action, to the interest level. But we also know, especially if we have teenagers who talk at 1.5 speed and listen to YouTube videos at 1.5 speed, that there are different capabilities of formulating thoughts and opinions at different speeds. It's not a reflection of intelligence. It's just habit. And so if you're able to formulate your thoughts and opinions, keep your speech at whatever rate you're comfortable, but you're able to formulate those thoughts, judgments, and opinions on a rational, logical, strategic, and intentional level at a fast pace, you will barely need that breath. And that's what's really incredible.
I love The Matrix. I actually watched it again a couple of months ago.
Really?
Become the spoon.
That is so funny.
Yeah.
I know what is it? Well, something about, but there is no spoon, right?
You said you've got to, yeah, you've got to become the spoon, I think. It doesn't matter. I just think it's amazing.
Yeah. Something about a spoon.
And I think, would that not be what the ultimate leadership is? Because that is where you are commanding your life and not just reacting to everything as it comes. You're actually taking control and responsibility for the outcome, not just for you, but for everyone, which is what a leader would do.
Absolutely what a leader would do. And getting back to where we started from at the beginning of this conversation, that doesn't eradicate a leader's authenticity or vulnerability. It doesn't mean the leader can't share with the community what is happening or what the challenges are or what their strengths and weaknesses are. It just means that they need to be aware of the reaction of that community to whatever it is they're going to share and ensure that they're proceeding in a manner that serves not just them, but also their community and their organization and the people they serve, right? And so sometimes it's very cathartic and it feels very good to just lay it all out there, but it's not necessarily the right thing to do. And the freedom to do that changes the more responsibility we add on to ourselves, right? With great power comes great responsibility. And it's actually a Voltaire quote, but if you're a fan of Spider-Man, it's also Spider-Man's uncle said it when he found out about him. But yes, that is the reality. With power comes responsibility. And with that responsibility, it's not necessarily a reduction in freedom. It is just a different exercise of that freedom because you are no longer in charge just of yourself and your own feelings. It's not to say you should ignore your feelings. In fact, quite the opposite. It's not to say that you shouldn't care about yourself. Again, in fact, quite the opposite. You are the master of your domain and you are your own primary point of maneuver, right? Before you can influence or direct anything else, you've got to start with you and make sure that you're leading your life in a way that you think is appropriate, including how you argue with your spouse, how you talk to your kids, or how you manage your team.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And vice versa, I would say that with great power comes great responsibility, but with great responsibility, you get greater power.
Oh, I love that. That's beautiful. We'll write an open letter to Voltaire that he could read posthumously.
Yeah, and it's not power over, it's just you have more power and control over your own life. You have
100%.
creative direction.
100%. And one of the things I talk about in the book is, I have done a lot of work in with NGOs. I founded a couple of NGOs. I am an activist. I am fully aware of external power dynamics. I'm not pretending that those don't exist. When we're on the streets of Iran and there's a big, scary morality officer with a huge Russian assault rifle pointed at us, we have less power than that person. So I don't ignore the existence of external power dynamics when I discuss responsibility or stoic control. Rather, it is, I understand that I cannot wrestle that gun away from this person and live. Now, I might choose to do it, right? And you know what? God bless those who do. The revolutionaries that are out in the streets of my country, I know that's wonderful. But you should know that's the likely outcome. You should be prepared for that likely outcome. And if that's not the outcome you want, then you can do what you can do, which is control yourself, not that morality officer's assault rifle, but yourself. And then use that control to exert as much influence on the situation as you can. This is a lot of what Viktor Frankl writes about too. You won't be able to leave the Holocaust camp just because you felt strong enough that day, but you can maintain your mind. And there's an extraordinary power to that, right? There is that thing that they can never take away from you. And I think it's really, really important to acknowledge both the existence of those external power dynamics and your power. And your power, that power which exists in all circumstances and which you can develop to get larger and larger and larger, which then, as you said, Natasha, with great responsibility comes great power. As you exercise that internal power, you tend to have greater influence in your life. It just happens. Things begin to change for you because you have exercised that power, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, no, I totally agree.
Yeah, I think that's a good point because you will grow your power over time. You're not just going to suddenly overpower a person with a gun, but if you have amassed a following,
Yes.
then you might have that greater power because then you've got some sway. But just as a person on the street, no, then you start small.
Yes, I love that analogy. As a person on the street, you might choose, for instance, getting back to my activism roots, you might choose to go on a hunger strike, or you might choose to do some street art, or you might choose, or there's still other things that you can do that would influence, that would impact, that would help to change the situation. And your capabilities between that isolated person caught off guard with your child on the street versus a group of 10 putting up murals overnight with political messages versus a group of 1 million chanting strong, right? So your external power dynamic has shifted and it all started from the same place, right? And so that's actually a really, really good way to think of it, Natasha. I love that. And so if you think of it in terms of that analogy, it's not necessarily that I'm going to have an army behind me because, I'm in a corporation or I'm at home with my family, but I have greater resources. I have more financial resources. I have greater flexibility in time. I have evaluated and formed the right alliances in my life. I have the right partner in my marriage who can be a great resource to me. I have the right friends. They can be a great resource to me, right? And so I've built that over time, partially and substantially, maybe even as a result of my ability to be intentional about how I approach these relationships, especially during times of stress, negotiation, or conflict.
Yeah. Love the way you've done it because it really is the basic building block to changing your life. Like you can go smaller than that, but I don't think you can go smaller than that.
So I love that you said that because it's so funny being on tour, and it's, a lot of people ask me, who's your book for? And I swear I don't know how to answer that question. I don't know who it's not for. I think it really, it can apply to almost any situation and almost anyone. It can be a starting off point or a midpoint, or you could be already incredibly sophisticated at this work and advance further, right? As we all hope we do every day that we live in the skills that are important to us.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I really hope it is my sincere wish that it can help people gain that, whether they're at the start of this journey or halfway through or even a master.
You know what it's doing? It's shifting the power from people trying to have power over to actually creating a connection with people that's genuine.
Yes, it's power through connection. One of the things that I want to be really careful about is that power through connection and the ability for a person to manipulate it. So, for example, a narcissistic person to go in and use their control over themselves and the awareness of the other person to completely control and manipulate them. That is a deeply ethical issue. And look, the reality is people misuse power all the time, right? I genuinely think this form of power is the one that is least likely to lead to misuse, precisely because it includes an understanding of the other person. It is far more difficult to demonize, villainize, and nothingize the other when we understand their motivations and where they come from. And so while power can always have a corrupting effect, and I don't deny that, I strongly believe individuals have the right to seek that power in their own lives, over themselves, over their immediate control and surroundings, and maybe even assistance with their community, right? That is what running for office is. That is what being a spiritual advisor is. So it is then up to the individual to use it for good. I try to incorporate as much ethics into the book as I can to ward that off and to warn others to be careful. I mean, really, at the end of the day, that's not the point of life, getting people to do what you want them to do. If you really want to have power through meaningful connections, they should be meaningful to you both, right? And so they should be furthering you both, or it won't work. Not in the long run. Not
Yeah,
in the long
absolutely.
run. Yeah.
Well, we can see that that doesn't work.
Yes. Yeah, that doesn't mean it doesn't get you power, right? Plenty of not so
It's
great,
temporary.
but it certainly doesn't get you emotional, spiritual fulfillment. It certainly doesn't get you lasting relationships and meaningful partnerships. It doesn't get you that.
No, or genuine respect.
Or
Or
genuine respect. I love that versus respect out of fear. Yeah.
what would be the difference between empathy and compassion?
So, the key difference between empathy and compassion is that with compassion, we tend to usually combine it with an action. So, I feel emotionally compassionate about your situation. So I hold your hand or rub your back or give you money or, give in to your demands in the context of this negotiation that we have or whatever the case might be, right? Whereas empathy does not have to include any action at all. Empathy is the understanding, maybe with or maybe without an emotional aspect to it, right? So the emotional empathy, as psychologists sometimes call it, is purely an emotional reaction. It's sort of like, your pain in my heart, right? You're watching your favorite TV show, your favorite character gets in a car accident. As the car swerves and the camera movement becomes jarring and the glass shatters, you recoil, even though it is not your skin being cut. It's not even a real person this is happening to, but you recoil from pain. And that is the emotional type of empathy, whereas more of an intellectual empathy, more of a cognitive one, would be the sort my mother would have displayed on the streets of Iran, or you might display if your company is being taken over in a hostile transaction, right? So and that spectrum, that empathic spectrum, it's all internal. There is no external action that needs to accompany it. That is up to you. That is a separate evaluation. It is not a component of the state, of the empathic state. Yeah.
This conversation can go so far. Okay, so would you, it would almost be like walking in the other person's shoes, like feeling how they might be feeling. But now you've got a person, for example, who is an empath. That is what they define themselves as. The stoicism then would kick in to say, what are my boundaries around this, right? So that is a healthy thing then. Instead of being totally consumed and feeling sorry that they lose themselves in it.
100%. Maybe don't, in that situation, walk in their shoes, but walk with them, next to them, match their cadence, match their rhythm and pace, so that you gain a much better understanding of where they are and why they're there and how fast they're going and when they feel dizzy, but you don't necessarily feel it yourself. And that is the distinction. So you're still there, you're still, and it still requires a deep understanding of the other person. Some would argue it's impossible to have a purely unless you are a psychopath, and I mean that not to misuse the term, but to actually accurately use the term. Unless you're a psychopath, it might actually be impossible to have pure cognitive empathy. But for the sake of the hypothetical, right? Assume that you have it. And then for the sake of the hypothetical, assume that on the opposite extreme of that, you have the full, I am in this person's shoes as if they are my twin sibling, right? And I can feel what they're feeling. And then note that the two are not a dichotomy. They are a spectrum. There's all of this room in between those two. And you can change where you are in that spectrum, not just from person to person and situation to situation, but even from moment to moment. You can go into something thinking, oh my gosh, I feel. And then halfway through think, wait a minute, I'm not so sure about that, and roll back. And you've done it before. We all have to some extent, and rolled it back, right? This isn't where I want to be with this person right now. This won't serve me. It might not even serve them, right? And then make that decision and shift it up. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, you're succeeding when you notice the need for the shift. So what I'm saying is the shift exists. Here's the spectrum that you were probably operating in anyway, but maybe, didn't have words for it, but you were operating in the spectrum anyway. Here's what I would say are the general boundaries of this spectrum. And your mere awareness of it can make you more adept at that movement. And then, of course, your ability to control yourself also makes you more adept at that movement. Because some people, they feel like they can't help themselves, but get emotionally intertwined in the lives of others. And they need practice on how to create that self-control, right? Not so they can be feeling less, but so that they can better control their own feelings. Yeah.
Yeah. So what would be the first thing that they could do to get control?
It's one of the things I really like about the book is there's very, very helpful exercises and meaningful tips. And it's, I tend to siphon it down. Obviously, I'd love it if everybody just read Greek philosophy for 40 years, but there are a lot of exercises that you could engage in. I am happy to give you a couple for this show. So one of the ones I love recommending to people is discomfort embracing. This is, in a lot of ways, we're already seeing it with, say, ice baths, or even really, really hot steam rooms, or people who exercise and embrace the discomfort, essentially become comfortable with the uncomfortable, so that they can be in more control of themselves when race day comes. Embracing the discomfort, however, doesn't have to be merely physical. And of course, you begin to habituate yourself to state of discomfort. Embracing the discomfort could be for someone who maybe isn't as emotional, allowing themselves to be vulnerable and feeling how uncomfortable that is. Now, obviously, choose carefully, do it in a safe setting, and then slowly habituate yourself to that feeling. So that if what you are lacking is you're much more cognitive than emotional, and you're finding that you can't maintain long-term relationships because you can't form emotional connections to anyone, then why don't you try this embracing of the discomfort that is emotional vulnerability? If you're on the flip side of that, practice the opposite, right? And that is, I mean, it sounds silly, right? It's just practice, but it is the idea that I am not going to reject this discomfort by walking away from the situation. Rather, it's uncomfortable, but I'm going to embrace the discomfort in order to gain strength from that discomfort. And that strength comes in my tolerance. And, people do this with just the cold. I used to do this when I first started out. I would just go outside in the cold. I didn't want to die of hypothermia, right? I'm not an idiot, but I would go outside in the cold without a jacket for X period of time, as long as it was safe. And then the next day, make it a little bit longer. And then the next day, make it a little bit longer. Now, I'm never going to be able to go outside in the freezing Chicago cold weather without a coat. But there is a guy out there who does that. His name is Ice the Hoffman. He does
I know.
marathons. Yeah, he does marathons in the Arctic on bare feet. So, I mean, he's mastered it, right? Now, obviously, he has remarkable capabilities and has dedicated his life to that level of discomfort. But it really is an excellent example. Or what we see Buddhist monks do when they're deep in meditation. The amount of even just physical pain in your body that you can manage and be okay with. People with chronic pain do this. If they're lucky, they learn to do this because a lot of times you're going to have the pain no matter what. So unless you embrace it, you're stuck in it. And so that is one method, embracing discomfort, that I really like, that I recommend to people, that I think is an easy, approachable one. And you can start small and take small baby steps and slowly, slowly, and really, really please give some thought. What is it that makes you uncomfortable? So if you're already like my husband, you're Mr. Tough Guy, you can work out 2, 3 hours a day and push yourself till the point of vomiting and fainting. That is not a good way for you to embrace your discomfort. A better thing for you to do would be to be present with your child and try to be vulnerable with them and express that vulnerability, right? So it's person to person. You know what they are for you. Hopefully, if you don't, through some self-examination, you can get there and then engage in it. Another tactic that I really like, I do it every year, I do it every year on my birthday, is I write my obituary, which is very reminiscent of the Stoic concept of memento mori, which is remember you must die, which actually means remember that you're not dead yet, right? What this does is I'm being super vulnerable with your audience now. I am extremely competitive and very ambitious and often want to do this and that and this and that. And when I sit there and I write my obit, I am forced to think about what I really want, what I really want, right? Not what I'm told I should want by such and such or such and such, but what do I really want? What do I want my life to have looked like when I am dead? And then I go backwards. Am I walking in those steps, right? To some extent I am. To some extent, I'm totally not. And to some extent, I sort of am, but could improve, right? And then I break that down. What habits, what interactions, what desires do I need to change in order to be the person I want to be? And so for me, writing my obituary turns out to be an exercise in hopefulness and beauty and life affirmation, and not at all, ghastly and mortal in its way, even though that's what it sounds like. But it's, again, I think it's a very easy exercise. Just sit down and write, what do you want people to say about you? What do you want your obit to say? And will it? And if it won't, how can you bridge the gap?
Love that, because what you're doing is you're taking it from the inside out and the outside in. So it's approaching it from both sides. It's not just coming from one place. Yeah.
100%. 100%. And you're stepping back and looking at the gestalt of your life all at once, right? You're actually seeing the forest. And normally, at least for me in my everyday life, I don't see the forest. I'm just trying to make it day by day, right? Get food on the table for the kids that has vegetables incorporated in it, and respond to the PR folks at the publisher on time, and answer my emails, and have office hours for my students. I mean, that's everyone's life, right? You're just trying to figure out the next step. So stopping to think not just what I want to accomplish in the next year or in the next 5 years or in the next 20 years, but who do I want to be? And how much do I want that to be evident to the world around me, at least after I'm dead, right? If not during my life.
I can see this could be applied to so many professions as well. Like, how would you use that in sales?
Yes. Sales is a big one. Sales is a big one. It's also a very tricky one because this is already very often applied in sales. Empathy is often applied in sales training. So this is why the salesperson smiles when you walk in the room or tells you that they like your shoes. They even change their tone, their cadence to adapt to yours, to give you a feeling of comfort and relation. They do a mix of endearment and pressure in order to get you to do what they want you to do. And a lot of that is actually empathy based. So what's really fascinating from a sales perspective is not how our understanding of the market consumer can enable us to sell them stuff, but rather, for me anyway, those aspects that relate to integrity. How do we do that while maintaining stoic control of ourselves so that we are true to who we are, right? So being able to understand the market and the consumer and the potential purchaser to sell them things is common sense in sales training. But how about the control we exert over ourselves in that situation? My mother was a salesperson. She sold area rugs after we immigrated from Iran. She had studied applied mathematics in Iran, but after we immigrated, she had to help get food on the table. She had to help my dad get food on the table. So she started selling area rugs. And this is something she really struggled with, is how do I put food on the table and get my kid braces, right? By selling more rugs while being true and authentic to who I am. And that walk required so much understanding of who she was at any given time and an understanding of the individuals with whom she encountered and negotiated on a daily basis. The reality is she gave more to people who she thought deserved more, right? That was her evaluation. If it was a single mom of two, and she knows because she goes to their house to measure, to do the area measurements or whatever, she would try to do a better deal for them than if it's a bazillionaire living in a multi-mansion. Is that fair? I don't know. You decide. She decided that it was because it was her way of giving a break. She was going to lose her job if she cut a break to everyone. But she could cut a break to some people from time to time and suffer financial consequences as a result. And that was a decision that she was able to make for herself. So again, that's where I come in with, I'm not here to moralize to anyone. And I'm not here to tell everyone, tell the truth all the time, no matter what. Tell your friend she looks fat in the skirt, tell your husband, I mean, whatever. I mean, these aren't necessarily the ways in which we lead our lives. And they're not necessarily productive. But we must be true to ourselves, right? And a large component of that is control over that self in the first instance.
Absolutely, because I would assume that a lot of that, taking the salesperson as an example, you might at one point say, I shouldn't be selling you this. I don't want to sell you this because it's not going to be good for you. And being ethical about that.
Yeah. And by the way, have you ever had that happen to you? Have you ever had a salesperson say, this isn't the right product for you? I've had it happen. Yeah, I've remarkably had it happen where I've walked in and I said, this is my budget. And they said, this is not the place for you. Or I've walked in and I said, these are my needs. And they said, listen, I'd love to sell you this, but there's a much cheaper version and it's really all you need. And you know what? one of the things, and that is a corporate value, and I think they really, a lot of those places share that corporate value of actually serve your customer, man. If you serve your customer, I go back to this day to those places because I trust. One of them was an auto mechanic. To this day, I use the same car mechanic to this day. And so he's gotten a decade and a half of business from me because he served me, and that is what I needed at the time. Instead of trying to get away with a one-time deal that would not have been true, presumably, to his own internal ethics. Because not only is it short-sighted, but also, how do you sleep at night? I mean,
Yeah.
don't you got to sleep at night? And so there's a lot of that happening as well as in terms of building customer loyalty, brand loyalty, and how infusing that integrity into your empathic interactions with the customers, even though they're designed to sell, let's not mince words. The salesman's job is to sell things. Despite that, you can do that job with integrity and you can do it in a manner that serves the consumer and the customer. And if you do that, they tend to be more loyal, and you can go to bed at night and still put food on the table and get braces for your kid. So that is the balance that you want to achieve. How you're going to go about achieving that balance, up to you. Again, the more intentional you are, the more you're able to step back and evaluate what it is that you want to do, how it is that you want to feel in that moment, and then utilize your understanding of the other to gain what you think is appropriate.
Yeah, I love that. And also, when you stand in your integrity, you respect yourself more. You feel better about who you are as a person. And then, of course, the better you feel, the more you get a dopamine rush, the more you want to do it.
True. It's true. Yeah. Happiness junkies know, or altruist junkies know, I should say. It's a really, really good feeling. And what's amazing is it's not about doing it so you can post it on social media or doing it so you can tell folks about it. It's about just doing it because that's what you think you should be doing. And there's this really great feeling you have at the end of the day. And that's not to say, I, by the way, violate this all the time in small ways, right? On a daily basis, I present myself in a manner that is inauthentic, like smile when I am sad, because I felt it was appropriate to smile at the security guard at my kid's school, even though I was having a really bad day, because he looked like he was having a better day, whatever. My reasons are my reasons, and I can make those decisions. I'm not saying that I insist on complete authenticity. What I'm saying is that smile was an intentional smile. It was the deliberate decision to engage with the security guard in a way that preserves my relationship, that maybe assists him a little bit, and doesn't cost me much, right? But in other instances, I refuse to smile at the person, no matter how much they want me to smile, right? Even if it costs me to do that, because that is the right thing to do. Because if they tell me one more time, you look prettier when you smile, I am gonna shoot them. And so this is a lesson that I need to teach. And I say specifically with smiling, because I genuinely think smiling is a gift you give to others, but it's not one that you always should, that they always deserve, or that you always have to give, right? Sometimes you don't, and you need to be in your own space and find that authenticity in your own space. But other times, hey, maybe do give that little kid a smile when he gave you a rock. Like, you're gonna throw out the rock, but it was a really thoughtful gesture. And there's the gradation. There's the gradation.
Do you find that women are expected to smile more than men?
Oh, 100%. Women are overall expected to be more agreeable and welcoming. And one of the things I speak with women about, particularly in corporate settings, is I've been there. I've been in that room. It's not my place to tell you, don't smile. It is simply my genuine desire to help you do what you think is appropriate. You should know as a woman that if you end all of your sentences in a downward inflection, that you will come across a certain way. And if you end the occasional sentence in an upward inflection, you will come across another way. And one of those is powerful, but maybe also a little strong and maybe also a slightly aggressive. And the other one of those is uncertain, but maybe also welcoming. And so you have to, do you want to sound uncertain, but do you value the welcoming more than the uncertainty? Engage in that evaluation. Again, I'm not the one in that boardroom right now. And so I'm not the one who gets to dictate how you use your tone. There's a guy I know, his name is Chris Voss. He's an FBI hostage negotiator. He teaches hostage negotiators to end their sentences in an upward inflection because they are negotiating with people who need to feel welcomed and validated in order to be controlled and manipulated. So it's not necessarily a sign of weakness as long as you are intentional about it. And if you decide to say it with all of your power, then you can decide, do you want it to be warm or do you want it to be cold? If you want it to be cold, be cold. If you think the right thing to do is to stand up during that meeting, be cold, strong, powerful, and aggressive, be that. If you think it's in between, find the in between and practice it. And if you think it's better to be welcoming and maybe risk sounding a little unsure so that people can feel more comfortable around you to gain their trust, then do that. But be intentional. Don't just resort to automatically ending your sentences in the same way because you have seen how people react to you when you end your sentences in another way, right? So make that decision, go into it, and play around with it and consider long-term consequences.
Yeah, I love that. Do you think it's a woman's natural space to be welcoming, or is that societally ingrained in us?
Well, this is an excellent question. I would have to say to some extent both, right? I'm sure there's some genetic component. Of course, there's a massive environmental component as well. I think it's very difficult to make these comparisons, at least from a scientific basis, between men and women, because it's very rare that genetics can be divorced in this manner from environment or from habit, right? Especially when we're talking about actions that don't really start to take effect or place until the person's a little bit older and therefore has already existed within an environment within a particular period of time. It's very difficult to isolate the variable. What I can say is we do, most certainly all of us, control how welcoming we are. And we can decide, even if it were true that such and such group of people tends to be more blah, blah, blah than such and such group of people, there are still divergences within the group. And you can fall anywhere on that divergence that you wish. And so, again, the point is more what it is that you want for yourself and how it is that you will gain that control. Without a doubt, women have the ability to present themselves in a powerful manner, but they can choose to be more welcoming and give up some of that power, or maybe they can find ways of combining the two, right? So that's going to be up to the individual person to make their decision, irregardless of what genetic or DNA or environmental trends might be. Again, if you are a woman living in a very conservative society, maybe a very conservative religious society or a conservative intellectual society, you're going to act differently because it's that different action that is going to result in your minimal power increase within that society. But you could also choose to be defiant. Now, you might get burned, but I mean literally get burned. But you might make that choice. And so again, my point is not up to me to make that, not up to me to make that decision. And yes, she had less power than I do here, right? And all of that is because of environment. But I don't know if she has less power than, say, a member of a disenfranchised segment of the society who is male compared to a female who is a member of the elite. So there's so many factors at play. I just think it's the wrong question because we can't know the answer. So I think the question is, how do I control what I can control? And that's really all I can do, right? I can't do anything else. It's out of my hands.
Yeah,
And a large part of me needs to accept that, but change what I can change.
yeah, I like that. And also, I mean, you could be a welcoming person that could be misconstrued in the company that you're in.
100%. I also, when I do tonal work with audiences, I talk a lot about what I call the Barry White voice, which is this sort of late night DJ. It ends in a downward inflection, but it's warm and welcoming, and everybody wants to feel close to you and feel like they're in your embrace. And there is a way to accomplish that voice. It takes a lot of practice, and it is kind of ridiculous that as a woman, you are much more required to undergo these tonal jujutsu tactics in order to succeed. But look, that's reality. And again, if you don't want to do it, don't do it. But you should be able to predict what the result is going to be in any particular setting and be willing to live with that.
Yeah, I love that. So on that note, where can people get hold of your book?
Okay. Thank you for asking. Stoic Empathy, it'll be everywhere. So, Amazon is probably the easiest, Target, places like that. But your local bookstores will have it, your local libraries. If they don't have it, request it. They can order it. It's in all of their ordering journals. So really anywhere and everywhere. In fact, if you have a local bookstore that you love, please feel free to go to them and ask them for the book, because I am very much pro supporting local bookstores and libraries. So if that is something that is passionate to you, please go ahead and do that. However, if it's easier to click that button and have Bezos mail it to you, Lord knows I do it 17 times a week. So feel free to do it. No judgment here.
Where can they get hold of you if they wanted to ask you questions or connect?
I appreciate it. I am on LinkedIn and I am on Instagram, and under both forums, I do respond to my private messages. It might take me a few days, depending on the volume, but I do respond, particularly if it's not a sales message and it's really a personal message or a question about Stoicism.
Awesome. I'll post all those links below. And then before we go, do you have a message for our viewers?
Message for your viewers. I like that. Yes. So my message would be, how about this? I really hope that 5 years from now, I am different than the person I am today. I hope that I am improved. I hope that I am better. I hope that I have changed in ways that add strength and compassion to me. That is an ever-changing and ever-moving process. It is my sincere wish that I could be of some assistance in the lives of others who are undergoing that same developmental and evolutionary process within themselves. And I hope you will allow me to do that. And I hope that you appreciate that that process is not an admission of inferiority or inability, but rather the acceptance of our continuing ability to grow as humans within ourselves and to influence the world and others.
Oh, beautiful. Well said. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natasha. I had a really great time.
Yeah, me too. I could talk about this for hours. So yeah. Definitely think, guys, go get the book. I think it'll be amazing. And yeah, I'll post all your links below.
Perfect. Thank you so much. It was very, very nice to be able to speak to your audience.
Yeah, no, likewise. Thank you for sharing. I really enjoyed that.
My
Have
pleasure.
an awesome day.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Shermin.